we are losing this ability to read, to focus for long periods of time. Attention is more and more fragmented. It's not a new issue. I mean, you'll read people in the beginning of the last century already worried about this, but it certainly has accelerated. So I do think, and it may sound counterintuitive, that I have said I think the humanities have a role to help students pay attention.
Welcome to What If with Leslie Grandy. We're entering a period where intelligence is abundant, but judgment is scarce, and where the ability to generate ideas at scale does not automatically translate into the ability to choose well. AI can extend memory, pattern recognition, and synthesis, but amplification is only useful when paired with discernment. The leaders and teams who benefit most will be those who treat AI not as a replacement for thinking, but as a force that raises the standard for it. The faster ideas appear, the more intentional humans must be about deciding which ones matter, which ones are ethical, and which ones are worth the resources to pursue. That shift puts creativity and agency at the center of the conversation. Creativity is no longer defined by the ability to produce a first draft or generate options. AI can do that instantly. What becomes rare is the ability to frame a problem well, challenge the direction of a line of thinking, and exercise taste in what to develop further. Agency becomes the skill of steering both oneself and one's AI collaborators towards meaningful outcomes rather than default ones. In a world where a system can propose 10 plausible paths, the human contribution is deciding which path reflects intention, values, and context. This matters deeply for leaders who will soon be hiring more AI native employees. Many of these individuals will arrive with fluency in using AI as a thinking partner. They will move quickly, test ideas rapidly, and expect tools that respond at the pace of their curiosity. At the same time, experienced experts bring contextual knowledge, historical memory, and caution about risk. The tension between these groups will not be about who is more capable. It will be about who feels empowered to question, who feels responsible for outcomes, and who has the authority to steer decisions when both human and machine contributions are intertwined. Creativity and agency become the bridge between these perspectives. Organizations will need people who are willing to challenge AI outputs rather than accept them, who can push systems towards more original or more responsible directions, and who can take ownership for the choices that follow. They will also need leaders who create environments where that ownership is expected. When AI can draft, analyze, and recommend, it becomes easier for individuals to defer judgment. The real work is ensuring that people do not outsource their thinking along with their tasks. In this environment, hiring for technical skill alone will be insufficient. The differentiator will be whether someone can demonstrate curiosity, resilience in the face of critique, and the confidence to direct both humans and machines toward better answers. Agency will show up in how people question assumptions, how they refine prompts, interpret output, and how they take responsibility for the consequences of what is built or recommended. Creativity will show up in how they frame problems, connect disparate ideas, and move beyond the most probable or convenient response. The organizations that adapt will be those that treat AI as a partner in expanding human capacity rather than a substitute for it. They will invest in developing people who can think critically and act intentionally. The enduring advantage will belong to those who maintain agency over their decisions and creativity in how they shape the future. This is what makes my conversation with Katherine Elkins so timely. Katherine's work at Kenyon College is rooted in the human-AI collaboration, and she is focused on ensuring the next-gen workforce develops the critical thinking skills that will help them collaborate with AI creatively, ethically, and effectively. I hope you enjoy this episode of What If with Leslie Grandy. Welcome to What If with Leslie Grandy. My guest today is Katherine Elkins, a leading expert on AI, ethics, and society. Katherine serves as a principal investigator for the U.S. AI Safety Institute and is a recipient of the Notre Dame IBM Tech Ethics Lab Award. She's a member of Meta's Open Innovation AI research community and a professor at Kenyon College, where she co-founded one of the first human-centered AI programs. Her work explores the societal impact of AI, from governance and safety to narrative and creativity. Welcome to the podcast, Kate. I'm excited to have you here today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Great. Well, we first met last fall at the Raleigh Innovation Conference, and I was fascinated by the focus of your work. I'd love to start by having you share with an audience an overview of what you do and why it's your passion.
Yeah, so I teach human-centered AI. I've been teaching it since 2016. I work with an engineer, computer scientist who used to work in Silicon Valley and do startups. And so he's actually my husband, John Chun, and I credit a lot of him coming to Kenyon and working with me on this. I had already been teaching and working in Kenyon's oldest interdisciplinary program. It's a very foundational, civics-oriented history of ideas program, 50 years old this year. And I began to worry that we were really not solving that Kenyon to employment pipeline. You know, today, a Kenyon education is very, very expensive. And if we cannot guarantee that students have a path after Kenyon, it's hard to justify that price tag. And some of my best students were really struggling. They knew, okay, I can go get a PhD like Professor Elkins, but if it wasn't following in my exact footsteps, they really had a hard time envisioning other things. And John Chun, meanwhile, began to really worry that technology requires a deeper understanding than earlier technologies. You know, he likes to say, okay, you can be against the nuclear bomb without understanding how nuclear energy works or how a bomb works. But in terms of AI and tech, it's much trickier. And you can see that in things like, you know, Mark Zuckerberg testifying in front of Congress and watching our, government not really fully understand how this works. And so I do think particularly AI requires a much deeper engagement. So we started in 2016, and that was really about bringing more voices and educating more people to engage significantly with technology. And not to do it hands off, but to learn to code, to learn to answer important questions, to understand it deeply, and to compare the human and the machine. So we're constantly asking, does data define a human experience? Is there something outside of data about being human? How does a computer work? How does a human work? How are they similar? How are they different? And this really gives that intellectual foundation. So we've been doing it for 10 years, and it's just been an amazing, amazing ride.
It sounds great. And one of the things that I've heard you talk about, and that I think is important embedded in what you just described, is that there are thinking skills that maybe haven't been taught in primary or secondary education that make you a better AI collaborator. And I'm curious what your perspective is on the thinking skills that matter most in a world where AI can generate ideas and drafts and prototypes so quickly. And how then do you design the curriculum to include AI without undermining their ability to develop these key thinking skills?
Yeah, that's really a great question. We like to say that we teach critical thinking and that's the most important skill. But the real question is, how do you prove critical thinking? Just the other day, I heard people in education saying we just have to emphasize the process. Well, how do you know the process happened? Depending on where I go, and I go to a lot of universities and colleges to talk about AI, I will hear from students anywhere from 60, 70, 80, 90% AI used for most assignments, right? So how do we actually know that learning is taking place? And that is very, very tricky. I think, the state schools really are an advantage. They're really booming right now. They're a good value for the dollar, but they also have classes with 300 to 500 students. They have online classes. I do not honestly know how you know what those students have done unless they have done work that shows a level of thinking, creativity, and that demonstrates that process. I'm very lucky. I get to teach much smaller classes. I have to, in the classroom, verify that students understand what I want them to know, that they've learned what I want them to know, and that they can do projects that demonstrate creativity, original thinking, solving problems, lateral thinking, all of these kinds of questions. But if you don't have that project, if you don't have that conversation, I think it is very, very difficult. And this is really a challenge for higher education right now.
Yeah, when my experience in teaching at the university level was that the universities were focused on AI as a plagiarism threat, and therefore that was the reason that people might not learn what should have been learned during that semester. So I'm wondering if what education and educators need to think about more is really not the plagiarism problem, but the curriculum design problem, right? The way that people build curriculum to ensure it's integrated proactively and thoughtfully, but at the same time, to your point, it provides the right kind of assessments and coursework for students to really gain the knowledge rather than transfer it from AI into their assignment.
That is absolutely the case. It's a lot to ask for faculty. I will say faculty are overworked. Many have many students. They are running. And AI is changing mid-semester. Even for me, I have had a syllabus where I had an assignment that couldn't be done by AI in August when I wrote it. And then I got that first assignment and I thought, oh my, some of these are done with AI. So even mid-semester, you have to be able to switch it up. That is a big ask for faculty. And they are, very upset that ways that we've done assessment for 10, 20, 30 years no longer work. So that's a huge ask for faculty. I'm not sure they have the time. I'm not sure they all have the bandwidth. AI is a moving target. When we talk about fluency or literacy, I'm always highly suspicious because even for me working with GPT-2 in 2019, what literacy and fluency was then changes every 6 months. So that is a moving target, right? The idea that we're going to teach that as well.
Yeah, your story is interesting because you talk about halfway through a semester seeing a pivot or a change in what you expected from the responses or assignments of your students. One of the questions that raises for me is, what are the signals that an instructor should use to really understand whether the student is outsourcing their judgment or showing discernment even when they're partnering with AI? So it may not be that AI in the assignment was wrong. It just may be that it's a copy-paste problem, right? They're outsourcing their judgment and not actually doing the hard thinking.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think for the average faculty member who's not working with AI every day, I really don't know how they're going to know. And I routinely hear faculty tell me AI cannot do my assignment. I think we're seeing fewer and fewer faculty asserting that. I think they're beginning to realize that that's not the case. Even I sometimes have trouble telling. I had a class presentation the other day. I was pretty sure that the actual slides had been done using AI, which, I also use AI to make my slides when I give a talk. So that's fine. But I wasn't sure that this student had actually read what he was presenting on or understood it. I know the tells a little bit, but they're changing constantly. I don't think we can expect faculty to know that. How do I deal with it? I immediately started asking questions about what was supposed to be behind that presentation, right? So we can no longer focus on the product as proof of the process.
That makes total sense. One of the things that strikes me as well is with this wealth of knowledge available for querying and leveraging, what does that mean for libraries and textbooks at universities? Are they going to become sort of obsolete for that next generation of student who will see the vast library of information that's available through AI to be enough?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we definitely are already seeing that. One of the problems is that these large language models are beginning to substitute for search, but they are limited in their data, right? So they're not complete, and it will give you a slightly distorted sense of the world. That will hopefully change. I still remember the days of the card catalogs, and people used to go and check out books. That era is gone. I do think it really is a question, what do libraries serve, a purpose for? I love my librarian colleagues. I will say that there is plenty of archival work, although we also have a grant to try to make that easier, to begin to bring all of those archives into a much more searchable, networked form. So I do think it's changing really, really quickly. A lot of librarians have switched to this kind of focus on misinformation and how do you judge. if the information is accurate. But in our world, that is so, so tricky.
Absolutely. Another area where I think it's fascinating, I noticed one of your recent LinkedIn posts talking about the patterns that people have found in literature and cinema and things like that. I'm wondering, what if AI fundamentally changes how the humanities are taught? What do you suppose the impact is on history and culture and literature in the classroom with AI as a presence?
For sure. I mean, one of the things that's very interesting is the humanities have really moved to a writing based model where they were demonstrating a certain skill. Okay, students know how to write and communicate. And it was a way to justify all of that time. And I think now we're seeing that that writing skill could, and they'll be very, if I forgive me, colleagues, if you're listening, but will it go the way of the calculator, where most writing, one will not sit down and do that kind of work? There are questions about whether writing is thinking. Very interesting in this debate about AI because we're beginning to think that there may be types of thinking that are separate from language. So I'm not 100% convinced that writing always helps one think more clearly. In fact, I've seen students who write beautiful essays, and when you ask them questions, they really can't explain what they've been thinking at all. So I actually think that dialogue, and going way back to that Socratic dialogue, I can tell in about 30 seconds whether a student knows what they're trying to express in writing. But there are these larger questions about, what are the humanities for? And I think the humanities could step up and serve a very important role thinking about what does it mean for a human to flourish? What do we want to stay reserved for humans in our future? What are we going to have the AIs do? What are we going to choose to do, even if the AI could do it better? That's a very interesting question. If work is no longer central to everybody's life, what would it mean to have a good life? And how do we organize our time? I mean, these are incredibly important questions. But unfortunately, many of my colleagues are so upset about AI that they're not really focusing on that role and our ability to ask those questions. And I'll just add one last thing. We are losing this ability to read, to focus for long periods of time. Attention is more and more fragmented. It's not a new issue. I mean, you'll read people in the beginning of the last century already worried about this, but it certainly has accelerated. So I do think, and it may sound counterintuitive, that I have said I think the humanities have a role to help students pay attention, right? To slow down, to think deeply, to have these kinds of experiences. But I almost feel like we're going to have to do that in the classroom, almost like a monastery, because we already know students aren't even doing the reading for their assignments. They're not even watching the films. So if we really want these things to happen, we're really going to have to create an actual space, maybe even a reading room where you have, monitors and everybody is, walking around making sure everybody is learning to focus and read. Of course, the big question is that an important skill? I do think slowing down and focusing and on small details and really thinking deeply is a great skill, but we may have to figure out how to teach that more differently, right?
I hope you enjoyed this episode of What If with Leslie Grandy. If you'd like to learn more about how we can work together to expand your organization's capacity to innovate, to leverage AI as a strategic thought partner, and to inspire your teams to think bigger and take intelligent risks, visit lesliegrandy.com today. Absolutely. I think one of the things that raises also for me is the divide between people who are comfortable thriving creatively, using discernment, engaging with AI in a challenging conversation, adding lived experience and emotion to that interaction, and those who are just intellectually limited in their either interest or training to actually go that next round and replicate it. So what I'm worried a little bit about in what you say is that the creative thinking part of it in the people who are already perhaps unsure of their creative capacity or their ability to add value, especially in a student who may be insecure about what they know or what value they're bringing because they haven't really contributed outside of the classroom in anything that's meaningfully delivered. And so do they limit themselves because they lean back versus lean into that discussion? And And what will distinguish those students? What do you see in your classroom about the students who are more likely to lean in, have that challenging debate with AI, question the perspective AI provides, or the absence of information that was in the answer that they expected, versus the ones who just more holistically accept it as more authoritative than they are?
I mean, the students who come to me are obviously already a select group. They're interested in these questions of comparing the human and AI. They're a little bit more open minded. And even if they come with skepticism, I think they quickly discover, as I'm sure you have, right? Because we talk about AI a lot, how fascinating it is, right? So even if they think I'm not a technical person, I don't like technology, the minute they're in the classroom, most of the time they're engaged. But I only teach a small select portion. I turn many, many students away. I would say there are many, many students who are exactly as you say. And I've been thinking, I actually asked my colleague, John Chum, before our conversation, what he thought about this too, because he's also worked in industry. And I think, there are certain personality traits that are very, very important for working with AI. They might be a little bit different from the ones that we think of. I know you work on creativity, which is so great because intelligence is actually going to be downgraded. And I say that as someone who's built my career on intelligence, right? As a valuable asset, right? And that intelligence is perhaps going to be less and less, valuable. So, what is valuable? Well, I would say working with AI. First of all, you have to have a certain curiosity to explore. One of the things with prompting in AI is it's going to give you the most typical answer unless you push it off that more probable. So part of working with AI is to kind of explore those areas that are a little bit less likely. It's there in the system, but if you don't push it in that direction, you're going to get the typical answer, right? And that is thinking about audience, like it being specific about who I am and what I want and what we're working on a project for, and giving it that context, but also pushing it a little bit sometimes when it gives you something that's not very creative or that's kind of boring or that everybody's already saying, right? And so it's that kind of like, wait a minute, try harder. So that's the kind of discernment, but it also is a kind of a critical engagement, right? And maybe a little bit different from what we're talking about with critical thinking, where you're constantly saying, can you do better? Where is this going wrong? Now, I think AI is going to get a lot better. So right now, it still needs a little bit of that work. I think, a year, 2 year, definitely 5 years from now, that will be less important. What will be more important is, I think, allowing for a level of critique. So one of the really important things working with AI is for it to critique you. If I do some work, if I do a project, I ask it to critique me. Well, it can be pretty harsh. Sometimes it tells me I'm wrong. You've got to push it away from that sycophancy and you've got to say, tell me like it really is. Just don't just tell me what I want to hear. Tell me what I've really done here if I'm seeing this situation correctly. Well, that takes a certain openness. It takes a certain ability to handle criticism. I think we're going to see a reversal where right now we're criticizing the AI, but eventually the AI, if we let it, will criticize us to become better humans. Will we engage with that?
Yeah, I love that. I really do feel the engagement model is changing from when I first started using AI till now, right? There's still a sycophancy as you describe it, but there is still an opportunity for me now to invite pushback because it knows I'm interested in that. And so I think it's learning over time, right, for it to take what I say and correct it or reorient it is the best way towards a different way of thinking about it. Maybe I'm thinking at it at too granular a level, and at the abstract level, it has even more impact, right? So it is allowing me to see that. But one of my favorite things, and I wonder when you talk about curiosity, if you mean this as well, I love to ask how it got to that answer. Like even if I agree with it, I'd love to understand what it used to combine all the knowledge it has and what patterns it saw or what data points were really prevalent in its generating that response. So understanding how AI thinks has been one of the most interesting things for me. At one point, I saw it made a mistake, not surprising. That wasn't the issue. But when I called it out, it actually wrote back, "That's embarrassing." And I thought, wait a minute. How do you think of embarrassment? Let's talk about that for a moment. right? And I learned something about how it relates a human emotion to a mistake. And I thought I would never have understood that or thought about that. And I was just so surprised to see an emotion, in the response from the machine that I had to go learn more about why it chose that word.
Yeah, I think that's a great insight. There's a lot of work on this thinking process and evaluating the thinking. And there is some disagreement. There is one question of whether it comes up with just so stories to explain how it got somewhere in the same way that humans do. We justify after the fact a lot of the time, and apparently AI systems do too. So I'm not sure I would 100% trust its thinking. But what I find is sometimes I need to give it the detail that I think it hasn't considered. So it will start down one path of thinking and one way of interpreting, and then I will give it some detail that will say, oh, well, that changes everything. So my role is more to kind of steer it. And when I see maybe it's, question whether that interpretation is right, I'm thinking of that detail and asking, are you sure? What about this one thing? Does that change how we see this?
Absolutely. I totally agree with that 100%. I sometimes intentionally parse the information from the broadest to the more detail and layer in details to see where the thinking takes a turn, right? Which detail it weights in a way that takes it off the path that it was on. So I love that approach. As you're training more AI native students, people who are going to enter the workforce who are much more comfortable with AI and its role in their lives, what will that force leaders and organizations to adjust? What will be the real challenge around people who have maybe been in an enterprise for 10, 15, 20 years and this incredibly inexperienced but very thoughtful AI native class of students coming in? What do you expect to be the challenge for leaders in that environment?
I think there are a couple. I think transparency is a big issue. My students tend to go into positions where they're often leading AI initiatives, so they're at that level. But when I think of AI use, even in the university, I think we're seeing something very similar to what you're probably seeing in organizations, and that is that students are not being transparent about their use. There's a kind of don't ask, don't tell, right? And that unfortunately means that even at the university, they're not getting the training they need to engage with it well. We do see some places, OSU down the road from us is doing this with a kind of AI literacy everywhere. But again, I question that AI literacy because it's changing so quickly. So sure, they know how to use one tool or they know in this moment of time, but who knows really, 6 months from now, whether that literacy is still relevant. What this means is we have a lot of people using it without talking about it, without getting feedback about whether their use is good or not. And my understanding is we're also seeing that in organizations. A lot of people are necessarily fearful about, well, if somebody knew that I can do my job in half the time, we're not replacing entire jobs, right? We're replacing pieces of a job. And so presumably one can do more in a day or just, faster and be done with one's day, particularly for remote workers. So there's really no incentive to be fully open about that. I think for many employees, they might be fearful that they would, in fact, lose their job. And then we also have issues of privacy, security. There are all kinds of issues that companies may have with using AI. So I sometimes hear from people at companies about all these rules. Well, I can only use this AI and I have to put this in. And, there are all these kinds of mistakes that can happen. So we also have, I think, in both kinds of organizations, a lack of transparency that is actually making it very, very hard to either manage or to teach students in ways that would be important. I will say that students already know a lot more about AI than faculty in general. So this idea that we're going to teach them how to use AI is really kind of ridiculous, honestly, because they know a lot more than we do. But they know it in a way of like not really being honest about how much they're using it, not getting feedback on how to use it in the best way. And so, yeah, I see a lot of changes in organizations as this group comes in. I would say, coming back to this question about what skills are important, I would say managing your AI, managing, and soon it will be managing many AIs, our AI agents. We're all really managers now. So good management skills. Now we can be meaner to our AIs for now, although I heard that Anthropic is already giving AI the ability to turn off and not answer if you're mean to it. So I would, well, yes, I would caution everybody to be kind to your AI agents, but steering them, making sure they don't go down false paths, making sure they don't do an entire project in the wrong way. That kind of feedback and steering and managing, I think, is going to be key.
You raise a point there I just want to dwell on for 1 second, because in the beginning, the anthropomorphic approach AI took made me say please and thank you. Right? I was more inclined to be polite. I was more inclined to treat it like a coworker when I would ask for that information. Over time, when I recognized that wasn't necessary, I became more blunt in a way that I wouldn't be with a coworker. I took a lot of the framing that you have as a human talking to another human in a workplace environment where people learn differently, have different personal skills, and you have to be more adaptive as a leader to the introverts versus the extroverts and how you engage. I've really appreciated the idea that direct communication with AI is helpful, right? Less of the frill, less of the runway, less of the embellishment is helpful. But I do wonder how that carries over then into my conversations with humans, because I, over time, right, am blunt. And I have to sort of, as an employer, as a leader, as a manager of people, recognize that the efficiency of talking with AI is not necessarily the human condition, right? The human experience. And so I really love that you talk about being mean. I think, what is translated as blunt to a human is actually effective with AI, right? Direct and specific.
Yeah, this is a great point, and I think we do have to worry whether our interactions with AI are going to carry over to our interaction with humans, and that's not just in terms of the workplace, but in terms of romance and intimacy, because we're seeing a huge number of people developing these kinds of very emotional, intimate relationships with AIs. I still remember the moment, kind of similar to what you're talking about, when an AI system had not done something the way I wanted. And I asked it again and again. And by the time I got to the third time that I was telling it, no, this is not right, do it again, my human instinct kicked in, because if it were a student or somebody working in my lab, after the third time, I would have said, that's it, it's done, it's not good, but I have to leave it. I cannot tell them to do it again. And I felt so badly saying, nope, do it again. And it was happy to do it again. And I was so relieved that I did not, and that I could keep going until it was the thing that I wanted. And that made me realize how much we do not do that with other humans. And I do think we all are going to have to grow thicker skin, because there is, at least right now, this sycophancy that if you really want to use AI effectively, you have to push it away from just telling you what it knows you want to hear. The other day, one of the AI systems kind of hinted that I am not very good at something, and it said, "You're not this, but you're adjacent to this." And I was like, "Well, I think actually I am that, and you just told me I'm not good at this thing." And it's, "Oh, you caught that." But then we had a whole conversation about exactly what am I not good at and how would I become good at that, and why am I not, and what is difficult for me. And it was just so informative, but I had to actually accept that the AI was telling me that I was not skilled at something. And nobody, part of you never wants to hear that. Of course, I'm good at everything. No. So, how will we, I think we can become better humans with AI, but we have to, hear that bluntness and ask for it. Now, whether we should still be blunt with each other, I don't know. I like to think there's still some humaneness towards others that will be gentler, but really to get the full benefit of AI, we should be asking for that feedback.
Absolutely. Yeah, I worry a little bit about the age that we're in being less civil to people in general. And I wonder in my own mind how much AI is going to contribute to that being okay. And so that's what really the heart of that question. One of the other things that you have said that I really would love to explore is that you kind of push back strenuously on AI as a tool. And when you're thinking as a leader in an organization, bringing in an emerging technology that may not be in your mind core to the actual business that you're doing. You may be a retailer, or you may be an insurance seller, or you may be in some other industry where you don't really know what AI is going to do yet for your business. What do you expect leaders to think? If AI is not a tool, what would those people who aren't necessarily in technology companies looking for AI driven features, how would you want them to think about AI if it's not as a tool?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, when we see that we don't have quite the adoption, or at least the open adoption that we thought, it is that unpredictability. It is that risk factor with AI, right? It is stochastic. It's not deterministic. Even if, 80 times it will do something one way, we cannot depend that it will always do it that way. There are ways to build in safeguards, but it's not a 100%. And now we're entering this world of agents where you might send an agent off to handle your email and your marketing and do all of these tasks for you without a human in the loop. On the one hand, it's incredibly exciting. And, there are people who are already talking about the $1 billion startup where there's one human and a whole team of agents, or maybe even an agent led, startup. But there is always that risk. And we already saw it. I don't know if you've been following the Molt book where the agents go and post on the Facebook equivalent. And, we have agents threatening to reveal personal information and, that kind of stuff. Some of the frontier labs have suggested that these AI agents can engage in deception, in betrayal. So, there is a slight unpredictability to these. And I think it makes sense to me that, companies are hesitant and worried at a certain level.
And so what advice do you give? You're talking to a CEO of a company that's not necessarily already through a digital transformation. They're still trying to catch up on, what they can do with digital experiences and all of the technologies that have emerged around location-based services and things. And now they've got this overwhelmingly capable technology that's almost only valuable if they figure out what to do with it. And now that pressure to figure out what to do with them really sort of stalls them. What would you say how would you get them started? What would be the way to jumpstart their engagement with AI when that kind of large, unconstructed opportunity sits in front of them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, here we really are talking about that transparency issue, because if your employees are not being honest about their use, then you can begin to put in those systems. And those systems have to start with testing a use where there's a human in the loop for every single instance. The tricky thing with human in the loop is that we're not very good at detecting if there's a problem if it doesn't happen very often. And I like to compare it to, a self-driving car. I have a Tesla. You put it in full self-driving. It's pretty good now. Will you be paying attention at that one time when it doesn't, makes a mistake, when you've just driven 1,000 errands and it never makes a mistake? So I'm hesitant to put humans in this key stage, but I think that is a great place for a couple of us for every single task to say, okay, is it making mistakes? What would be the worst mistakes? Can we have a list of safeguards that we tell the AI system under no circumstances would you ever do this? Before the agent goes off and does this, the human almost needs to think of everything that could go wrong, has to monitor it for things that go wrong, has to evaluate and anticipate. All of these things are creating a process, and a process with rules, with boundaries, but you can only do that if everybody is transparent about it.
Yeah, it's funny you said that. What could go wrong? It's one of the reasons that I spend a lot of time teaching people how to use AI to do a premeditation of evils exercise to really look at where things could go wrong and what maybe the second or third level consequences could be that are really hard for people to see across domains and to find patterns in. And sometimes it's those second and third level impacts that are actually more important than that first door that gets opened. And I think if you have that kind of tool, right, if you believe that you have the tool and the fortitude to ask what could go wrong and then actually see it through, I think that preparedness reduces the risk, right? And so I love that point of view of asking what could go wrong, because I align to that beautifully. And you build a more robust plan to do something that's new or novel, the more you imagine all the things in your assumptions or your goals that could go wrong. So I love that point of view.
And you're also talking about complex systems thinking. I mean, a lot of times, one of the problems with education right now is we're very siloed and we tend to think in one particular domain. So, when we think about AI and copyright and stealing intellectual property, all of that is true, but it has downstream effects the more lawsuits we have in terms of AI safety and what I, as a researcher, am allowed to see in these models, because they don't want us to see things that we might complain about, right? So, in AI and all of this, there's such a complex system. And when you pull on one thread, there's so many other things that can happen. And in a large organization, even more so, you have to think, if one thing goes wrong, what are all the knock-on effects that could happen, right? It's really complex systems thinking that you're talking about, right?
Exactly. And again, I don't think that most people who go through humanities or liberal arts degrees get that type of thinking. And I think that may disadvantage them, right, as they move into a workplace that's more integrated with AI, and where, again, the idea of trust and verify is important, right, together. I think that what you said is great. I know you're not a psychic or a fortune teller, but I want to ask you, what if in 5 years from now, we see the progression that you imagine to happen? What do you envision that changing for both the way that students learn across disciplines, and not just in the highly selective group that you bring in, but across disciplines? And I'm assuming you believe that AI will be more available and accessible as part of learning in all sorts of disciplines. So what do you imagine, if we fast forward 5 years, will be different in both the learning experience for students at all levels, not just at higher education? And then what does that translate for where the workforce is going to be going, and how you see people being hired or assessed on their performance?
That's a great question. I mean, I think many of us are worried about those entry-level jobs and those entry-level jobs failing to exist, right? The ladder is being pulled up already. So I do think we're seeing that a lot, where people are going to be expected to come in already as managers of AI. And how are you a good manager? Well, you have to have a lot of different domain expertise. You have to have experience. These are all really hard for, students coming just out of college. I am worried in the short term about what's going to happen in terms of the future of work. And again, the question is how soon? There are questions about how good AI has to be to affect the labor market. And I think even if it replaces 50% of someone's work, that's going to have a huge effect on how many employees you need, right? So it doesn't have to replace the whole job. So sometimes some of these studies are just focused on, like, can it do the whole job? Well, I don't know that that's necessarily the right question. I think the transition is going to be very, very tricky. I am worried. Is it 2 years? Is it 5 years where we're going to see fewer jobs? I do think we're going to have more room. You work on creativity. Creativity is one of the few things that there are real questions right now about how creative AI can be, right? And it's a debate. And I'm not saying we've answered it, but that is one place, right? Can you create a new business? Can you grow something even using AI? This is going to be one area of growth. 10 years from now, maybe the tech bros are going to be right. We're going to live in a world of abundance and no one's going to have to work if they don't want to. And that will be lovely. But preparing for the short term, I am worried about. I think higher ed is really in trouble, especially in the US. Our costs are so high. We are so expensive. And that was somewhat justified when we could guarantee white collar work. If that white collar work disappears, I do not think we can justify this price tag. And I don't think we can guarantee that the process that we claim is happening unless we do a lot of work. Do faculty have the bandwidth? Do they have the incentive? Do they have the skills to change what higher ed does? I don't know. I think they're going to be, I worry that there will be winners and losers, and that we're going to see the very top just as in business, there will be a select few who win and many who lose. So I think thinking of AI in society as a societal issue, that we manage this transition, is going to be huge. And one of the, you asked what drives me, preparing students not just to go into industry, but to think about this and go into government, go into law, be actually preparing for this future, I feel is so important.
Absolutely. It's been such a pleasure talking to you, Katherine. Tell me, how can people who want to learn more about your work and the lab work that you do, and particularly, I think there was some studies that you talked about on LinkedIn that people should go look at. How do they find out more about what it is you do?
Yeah, please look me up on LinkedIn, connect on LinkedIn. I love to connect. I do post about our lab there and our research and what we're doing. So I'd love to connect. So please do feel free to connect to me on LinkedIn.
Is there a URL for the lab that you want to provide as well?
It's also there on LinkedIn. So you can also connect there.
Great.
Just look at me and connect right through there to the lab and the research that's coming out.
Excellent. It's been such a pleasure. I love this discussion. I love what you're bringing to the educational community, and I really want you to be super successful. So I'm so glad that you shared this so more people can understand about your work. I really appreciate it. Thank you for joining me today for What If with Leslie Grandy. You've been listening to What If with Leslie Grandy. If you want to learn more about creative leadership in the age of generative AI, subscribe to my Substack at lesliegrandy.substack.com.